All right, I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, thank you for joining us for our Tuesday tips. I'm so excited that the UKS team is back with us again. I'm going to put you on mute. Yeah, if everyone can stay on mute, that would be greatly appreciated too. The team at UKS was unbelievably helpful in the very beginning when we first went into COVID. I said I felt like I saw them every other week, and I haven't seen them in about a year. So welcome back, guys. So Tuesday Tips was created from our mixed groups, which is the Chamber's Middlesex Information Exchange group. So we've got about 3 months worth of Tuesday Tips every Tuesday from noon to 1. So we're glad you could join us today. This one obviously is a very important topic, COVID-19 vaccinations and what employers and employees need to know. So thank you again, guys, for joining us. Please stay on mute for the entire meeting. If you have a question, they're more than willing to take your questions. You can either use the chat function or you can raise your hand at the bottom and I will call on you directly and you can unmute and ask your question at that time. So again, thank you for joining us. And I'm going to turn this over to our great leader of our legislative group, Rich Corella.
Thanks, Johanna, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm calling you from my car, so I'm going to introduce my colleagues here in a minute and then probably just sign off because I've got to get on the road. But I first want to thank the Chamber and especially you, Johanna, for setting these up. Like you said, we've been doing these with the Chamber for well over a year now, and it seems like they were really busy at the beginning and that it died off for a while, but things are picking up again, and the topic today is really topical and timely about COVID-19 vaccinations and coming back to the workplace. And we've got two great speakers today, my colleagues from Updike, Kelly and Spellacy in our Hartford office. Valerie Fredone is an attorney in the litigation and employment practices section of our firm, and attorney Chris Brigham, he's the chairman of our employment practices group. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris at this point and Valerie for them to kind of lead the discussion, and look forward to an interesting conversation. So thanks again, and Chris, over to you.
All right, thanks, Rich. Yeah, I'm actually going to turn it over to Valerie here in a second. Valerie's going to start us off. We're going to just, so you don't get bored of one of us or the other, we're going to split it up here and share a little bit. But Valerie's going to share the screen. I think, as Johanna said, we don't have a preference. If you want to ask questions as we go along, just interrupt us until we stop talking, and we'd be happy to entertain questions as we move through, or take them at the end, either way. But we're really happy to be back with you guys. It seems like a long time since we've been together, but it's hard to believe that it's probably been over 12 months since this all began. But there does seem to be sort of a resurgence of interest in having some of these informal discussions, just because everybody's now really focused on getting folks back to work, which is awesome, as I'm sure we all can agree. So I'll turn it over to Valerie, and then I'll be back in a minute, and just thank you all so much for joining.
Thanks, Chris. And I hope you can all see my screen share right now. I think it's working. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of background about the new bill that Biden signed on March 11th, which is kind of a continuation of FCRA, which was the buzzword from the beginning of COVID until the end of last year. This is the American Rescue Plan Act. It's a $1.9 trillion relief package that Biden signed, and it kind of continues some of the efforts to help employers and employees during this time, but also make some changes. As you're probably aware, FCRA provided paid sick leave and paid family leave for some employees who were eligible, who were missing work due to COVID-19. Employers are no longer required to provide FCRA, paid leave, and family leave, but employers can opt to do so and will continue to receive tax credits for providing leave through September 30th, 2021. American Rescue Plan Act also increased the amount of tax credits per employee from $10,000 to $12,000. And probably the biggest change is, in addition to providing leave for employees who have to miss it for childcare or for getting sick from COVID, the ARPA also allows employers to provide employers tax credits if they provide leave for employees who are getting vaccinated or recovering from getting a vaccine. As we've all heard, there have been some adverse reactions. So if an employer decides to pay an employee during the time they're out recovering from the vaccination process, the employers can collect tax credits from the government for that reason.
Hey, Valerie, can I add one thing in here real quick?
Yes.
Just to remind everybody, if you're going to do that voluntarily, be really consistent. Don't sort of differentiate between who you're going to allow FCRA payment to go to. So, if you're going to allow someone to get it because they're home, sick or taking care of someone sick, or if they get vaccinated, just sort of make the decision. Are we going to allow FCRA or not? And then if you allow it, make sure you're consistent across the board. Don't sort of pick and choose which ones which eligible factors you're going to compensate for, if that makes sense.
And as with the vaccine rollout, there has, of course, been some employment issues that have arisen out of this. And one of the biggest questions that we've been getting is, can we mandate our employees to receive the COVID-19 vaccine? And this is it's a really tricky question, and we're going to cover a little bit about this now, and then Chris is going to go into a little more detail at the end based on what we've kind of learned from our clients' experiences so far. But generally, at-will employers can set working conditions related to health and safety. And especially in the industries like healthcare and childcare, in the past, those have usually mandated flu vaccines and other types of vaccines for their employees because it fit in with the purpose and the safety of employees, patients, children, things of that nature. And the EOC has recognized that an employer can mandate a vaccine if failure to do so would pose a direct threat to other employees in the workplace. And that's a really important thing to understand, that you do have the right to as an employer, because COVID-19 has been determined to pose a direct threat to the employees in the workplace. However, there are some exemptions to this that employers should be aware of, and those are for employees with disabilities and for those with religious objections to getting a vaccine. First, I'm going to talk about the ADA, which is the first exception to vaccination. The ADA prohibits employers from discriminating against qualified individuals with disabilities. And you probably heard this in other contexts. You can't discriminate against employees in the hiring process, in the promotion process, on the basis of a disability. And this comes into play with COVID-19 because some employees may not feel comfortable getting the vaccine due to a disability or a health condition. And the EOC has said that an employer can mandate the vaccine as a safety-based job qualification if an unvaccinated employee would pose a direct threat. So again, this direct threat threshold is what you need to think about when you're deciding whether an employee can come into the workplace unvaccinated. So if you have an employee that comes to you and they say that they can't get the vaccine because of a disability, you have to go through an interactive process with them. You need to explore the options for an accommodation for them. And you need to see whether the 4 factors are met. The 4 factors of determining whether the employee will pose a direct threat is first, the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood that the potential harm will occur, and the imminence of a potential harm. So the EEOC provides that if an employer goes through those 4 factors and they still feel like an employee who's unvaccinated will pose a direct threat, that is an issue, and that they need to go through an interactive process with the employee. So you need to see look at this employee is going to pose a direct threat. Is there anything I can do as the employer to accommodate this disability? So you go through and see, could I provide an alternative working environment? Can you isolate the employee from others? Could they telework? Is there any way that you as an employer can accommodate this individual with a disability? And it doesn't mean you have to, but you have to go through this process. That's what the EOC wants employers to do. To go through the process with them, have a conversation with the employee, and see if there's anything that can be done. Another question that might arise is, how do I know the employee has a disability? Typically, you can ask for documentation of a disability because we are requesting to have an exception to a rule of vaccinating employees. However, the EOC has said you cannot ask for documentation if the disability and the employee's need for reasonable accommodation are obvious, or if that employee has already provided you with information sufficient to establish that this employee does in fact have a disability. So along with the exception for disabilities, there's another exception, and that is under Title VII. This prohibits discriminating against employees because of religion in hiring, firing, other terms and conditions of employment. But this also comes into play because some employees may not want to receive a vaccine because of their religious beliefs. We've heard about this a lot in schools and in other contexts for getting vaccines for measles and things of that nature. So again, an employee may come to you saying that they feel strongly that they should not be vaccinated due to their religious belief. Under Title VII, employers must provide a reasonable accommodation based on a sincerely held religious belief, unless it would impose an undue burden on the employer. So again, this is similar language to the ADA. However, an undue burden is even less stringent under Title VII. Undue burden is more than its de minimis cost or burden on the employer. So again, it's less stringent, and there's a lot of rules that go along with what is the definition of religion. The EOC says it's not just what you would consider to be a religious belief in general terms. It goes beyond membership in a church and includes firmly and sincerely held moral and ethical beliefs. However, it does not cover social, political, or economic philosophies or personal preferences. So again, this is a very touchy area. It requires the employer to have a discussion with the employee, seeking additional information about what exactly is the belief, what is this religious belief that the employee has that makes them not feel comfortable getting a vaccine. And actually just yesterday, the Connecticut House of Representatives, they approved a bill that would remove the religious exemption option for students going to public schools in Connecticut. Right now, under Connecticut statute, there are required vaccines. There's about a list of 10 of them that students must have before they before they're allowed in public school. And in the past, parents would sign a form saying that these vaccines were against their religious beliefs and they would be exempted from that. This has been a hot button issue, and the House finally was able to pass a bill that would, if it passes in the Senate, get rid of that exemption for religious beliefs. So really the only exemption that students would qualify for would be a medical condition, disability type reason for not getting vaccinated. Again, this does have to go through the Senate, and this does only apply to public school students. This doesn't apply to adults, but it does show you that this is a hot button issue. This religious exemption situation could trickle up to a federal level and applying to adults. But again, that is probably far in the future, but it's something to keep in mind, that this is in the news. It probably will come up a lot in the future. And to finish up my portion, just a few other side notes that might be of interest. Employees do have some protections in the workplace if they feel strongly against mandatory vaccines. The National Labor Relations Act, it protects both union and non-union employees for voicing their concerns about all different programs within their employment, including a mandatory vaccination program. And employers can't terminate employees for speaking out or for engaging or refusing to engage in such programs. And there's also prior OSHA guidance that employees can refuse to get a vaccine due to a medical condition creating serious illness. Again, this is just past OSHA guidance, and OSHA has always protected employees from whistleblowing. If they speak out in the workplace, they're usually protected from being fired by the employer. So it's just kind of a situation you want to take lightly if employees are starting to talk about their own beliefs about the vaccination process, or discussing it amongst themselves. Just want to be careful about not taking any adverse action against them. And there's also some things to consider that kind of protect employers. This hasn't really come up a lot yet because we haven't seen how the COVID illnesses will be treated under the law and under workers' comp. It's still very early. However, the thought is that if an employee contracts COVID at the workplace due to an exposure in their office or their work site, that would be covered under workers' compensation. And that would provide the only avenue for the employee. So usually if you bring a workers' comp claim, you can't also bring a civil action at the same time. So that kind of protects the employer and minimizes the exposure in a way where it's just limited to a workers' comp claim and not any other action. And then also, if you implement a vaccine program, this could be covered under PrEP, which is Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, which may protect employers who have these programs from being sued if there's any adverse reaction to a vaccine that's required or implemented by the employer. So those are just things to keep in mind. Again, it's still really early in this process, and we're not sure how COVID and vaccines are really going to play out in the scheme of all these things. But this is just our, where we think it's going, and it's ever changing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk a little bit more about the impact of vaccines on employees and the workplace.
All right, thanks, Valerie. So far we've talked really about two exemptions, right? The medical disability and the religious exemption to getting vaccinated. We've seen some of that, to be honest. So far, that's been pretty easy to navigate. It's fairly straightforward. If you get a medical note from a doctor, that's going to trigger you to have some conversations with your employee about it, which you're entitled to do, and see if you can accommodate them. Have that discussion. We've seen some of the religious exemptions, but not as many. But the main thing that I think you're all probably dealing with or will be dealing with is just the general resistance to the vaccine for whatever reason, other than a medical exemption and or a religious exemption. There's certainly still a level of concern or mistrust, or I just don't know enough about this vaccine for me to take it. So we're seeing, we're seeing a lot more questions about that. Not just can we mandate, because not many people are mandating the vaccine. I mean, I think we're seeing the mandate in the healthcare industry, and more so than in other places. Most of our clients are highly recommending, encouraging the vaccine, but there's still a level of resistance out there from some employees that just don't want to take it. And then how do you how do you deal with that? You know, if you've got a large population, I mean, we've had employers that have done anonymous surveys of their employees to sort of get a gut check of how many of you are going to, you know, are interested in getting vaccinated. That's a good sort of litmus test to see. Has to be anonymous, but you know, you might have a level of confidence there that, gee, we're going to get to 75, 80% of our employees regardless. So let's just make it voluntary and get to herd immunity or close to it, and you know, cross our fingers from that point forward. So you still, though, the point is even with the resistance, even though it's not an ADA or a religious exemption, you still want to address that the same way. So much of this is common sense employment management, right? It's like, we're going to talk to our employees, we're going to figure out what their concerns are, see if we can address them. You know, if their concerns are legitimate, we're going to see if we can accommodate them. And you know, hopefully sort of keep things moving forward. I think we can jump to the next slide, Valerie. So one complicating factor, and I don't know about all of you on the phone, how many of you are doing this, but certainly we've had a number of clients, again, in the healthcare industry, in the educational setting, you know, that have wanted to get this one and done, right? You know, let's just set up a vaccine clinic here at the office or on the work site and get everybody vaccinated at the same time. There are a lot of dangers that sort of or cautionary tales with that. I mean, one, it makes it a lot more complicated about now that you are actually serving as the vaccine program, you know, questions that you can ask and questions that you can't ask. The EEOC has come down and said, you know, a vaccine or a COVID test is not a medical inquiry or a medical exam under the EEOC. So they've created some leeway there, but they're still really restrictive in terms of going outside of that. So if you're going to run a vaccine clinic, you know, you're not able to. They're more restrictive on what you can ask and what you can't ask, and you need to be really careful about going beyond that limited inquiry into other medical conditions or other disabilities. So the EEOC is really suggesting two alternatives. You know, make the program strictly voluntary, and that way you don't run afoul of any of the ADA restrictions, and do what most folks are doing. You know, leave the vaccine to the healthcare industry or, you know, the health care providers. Let people go out and get them through Hartford Health or Yale New Haven or Trinity or whatever the, you know, CVS, Walgreens, you name it. I mean, I think at this point, we've all been through those of us that are getting vaccinated have been through the VAMS website and know the process. But the point is there's a distinction there between sort of employer responsibilities. If you're taking on that responsibility as a vaccine program, as opposed to allowing your employees to go out and get vaccinated on their own, certainly a much easier road to take. So in terms of offering proof, we're a little bit back and forth on this right now as we talk today. The EEOC says you can require proof of vaccination. You can ask your employees whether they've been vaccinated if you maintain that information confidentially, but there's a movement afoot to sort of not allow employers to do that. We get questions all the time about, you know, can we ask employees if they're going to get vaccinated? You can, but as long as your program, so to speak, or you're going to do it voluntarily, I mean, what's the point of asking? You know, there's not, that information is not all that helpful. So the answer is yes, you can, but the bigger question is whether you should and whether you're sort of inviting, you know, complications by having that information. So instead of mandatory, as I said, you know, making them voluntary makes things a lot easier for a whole host of reasons. And most of the folks that we're dealing with are going the voluntary route and getting quite, you know, they're getting pretty high numbers to participate. But a lot of discussion centers around, you know, can we offer vaccine related incentives? And again, the answer to that is yes, but what you want to be careful about is, if you make these incentives too incentivizing, i.e. too large, too much, do you convert what's a voluntary program into an involuntary program? So our suggestion is that if you're going to offer incentives, keep them small, keep them reasonable. And if you really want to be cautious, you offer the same incentive to the employees getting vaccinated to those that aren't getting vaccinated. That would dispel any problems. So for instance, if you say to your folks, your employees that are going to get vaccinated, look, we'll give you 3 hours of paid time to go do this. You may want to think about giving 3 hours of paid time to someone who has chosen not to get vaccinated. You can do it that way. The other option is just to keep the incentives low. Some paid time off, some coverage of costs, and employees seemed a lot more inclined to go out and get vaccinated on a work day if they're getting paid for it, as opposed to doing it on their own time. So we do see some incentivizing, and it makes sense. I mean, if we're trying to create a safe workplace, it makes sense to say to your employees, if you want to go do it on a Monday morning when you can get in, we'll pay you for your time that it takes. Valerie had mentioned earlier, that if you do choose to continue to allow for the FCRA paid sick leave, you're now allowed to use that for time vaccinated or for recovering from a vaccine. So there is an argument, no harm, no foul. You could pay your employees for that time, but you could also get the back end tax credit for that time. Again, with respect to my earlier admonishment, you just want to be really consistent in application. I had mentioned, that you can ask for your, whether your employees are going to get the vaccine, but here you can see a proposed bill that if that passes through the legislature, that's going to put a kibosh on that, and that employers are not going to be able to ask. I think just in terms of tying this in a little bit with Valerie's earlier topics, right now at the state level, in terms of COVID-19 vaccines for adults and younger adults, we're now at a point where anyone 16 and over can get the vaccine. This is not state mandated. It's likely not going to be state mandated, especially if we continue to have the high numbers of individuals getting vaccinated voluntarily. The state's not going to step in here and do what they did many years ago with the school-aged based vaccines, which was now state statute. But who knows? If COVID, God forbid, it comes back roaring back at some point in the future, and we're back in this, there may be a lot more aggressive action taken than there is right now. Same thing with federal. The federal government has some ability to mandate, but they typically defer to the states to do that, and that's why we see a Connecticut state statute on school-age vaccines. So sort of a bottom line here, in terms of what we're seeing and what we're advising, we're seeing much more voluntary vaccines than mandatory. There are some, I think, industry-specific mandates. I know that a number of businesses are planning to mandate the vaccine when they bring people back to work. We've seen it at the college and university level. There are a bunch of colleges and universities that are now going to be mandating the vaccine for return to campus in fall of 2021. So the answer still continues to be yes, you can mandate, but you need to comply with those exemptions, that Valerie pointed out. So just briefly to close here, and then happy to take any questions. Again, I mean, you sort of see the vaccine, the mandate, the exemptions. A lot of our time is being spent dealing with that, but a good portion of our advice is just now sort of triaging return to work issues with employer clients. And what do we do now that we've created this, don't take this the wrong way, but I'm gonna say this entitlement to work at home. I can say, my firm, our firm, we're coming back this summer, and we've sent out notification of that. We're not mandating vaccines, but we want people to get back to work. We're committed to providing a safe work environment with continued social distancing and masking. But we and a lot of other businesses sort of want to be back together again here in the office. If that is what your plan is, the best thing to do is, yes, you can mandate people to come back. You are the employer, the boss, so to speak. And you can dictate that people come back to work, but we're sort of talking about, provide advance notice that you're going to be requiring that, give people some time to think about it. You should continue, whether it's, to let people talk to you about it. If they have a medical condition that puts them at higher risk for COVID, or that, makes them worried about the vaccine, they should be able to advise their employer about that. And you want to have that interactive dialogue, that process of discussion with that employee as to whether, there's any additional accommodations that are necessary. I have one situation going on now where a client business is coming back to work in May, and they have a couple of different scenarios, a pregnant employee, an employee over 65 with comorbidities, and so you get these medical notes saying, look, I've been working at home for 12 months. I can't come back to the office because I'm at increased risk of COVID, and I don't want to get vaccinated. And really the answer to that is do the same thing, talk to them, see if there's an accommodation that can be made. If you want people to come back to work, and there's really a good reason to have them come back to work, that you're entitled to require that. But I have one situation where they've made some additional accommodations, like, listen, come back to work. You work in a separated structure. We'll allow you to work in your office with your door closed. We'll allow you to participate in meetings via Zoom, or we'll hold them outside eventually. Small accommodations there that essentially send the message that you're going to be as safe coming back to work as you are working at home and going to the grocery store every other week, or whatever the case may be. But I think the real emphasis here is to provide advance notice, have the discussion, stick to your standards and your dictates, but be prepared to be flexible, and at least talk to your employees about their concerns, because it's going to make it a lot easier if you've given them that opportunity. And then at the end of the day, you sort of draw the line in the sand where you think it's best to be drawn, but at least you've protected the employer by going through that process. What's next, Valerie? Oh, the end is next. So I don't know if I lost the chat here, and Joanna, if you're still on.
Yeah, I apologize, everybody, but we lost internet at the chamber, so I'm on my phone. So the way in which we were originally going to do this is, if you had a question, you could utilize the chat function, or if you wanted to raise your hand, we could ask you to unmute and you could ask the question. So if anyone has a question, you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat function, which we are monitoring. It's a little bit tricky on our phones, but we'll get through it. So I'm sure there's some questions. So use the chat function or raise your hand.
I think, Valerie, if we want to take down the share screen, maybe we can see if anybody, I don't see anything in the chat.
Somebody from Wesleyan Potters has a question. I just unmuted them.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Liz Blodgett, and I'm the director at Wesleyan Potters. We are a nonprofit. We have several staff members, but we also are a co-op with over 80 members. Several of the members of the co-op have asked, are we going to have mandatory vaccination here? And I have been telling them, we're really aligning ourselves with what Connecticut is doing. I just want to have a clearer answer for them. If you are a co-op member, not an employee, what is the organization's responsibility? Or it's a little trickier than a business that just has, part-time and full-time staff people.
Yeah. So can you explain a little bit more what that relationship is? A co-op member is exactly what?
So we have they're called key members, and they will come in and they run kilns and they make glazes and they work in buildings and grounds, or in finance. That a lot of our model is successfully done by volunteer, but very passionate, devoted people.
Yeah.
But they don't happen to be employees.
Yeah. I think I get it now. So in the employment context, I mean, like an employer that has vendors that come on site,
Right.
third-party vendors, things like that. I mean, you can mandate that they be vaccinated and they can choose to do or not do business with you. The mandate is really tricky though, because it just, our experience so far has been, that outside of certain industries, mandating just creates some resentment, about being
Right. And
right.
my feeling is to keep it voluntary.
Yeah.
But we do have a couple of members who have said, I hope, hopefully we're going to do this mandate. And I'm like, I think it's trickier than.
It is trickier, and it's also the problem is you really can't share that information, right? So
Right.
with your members that are saying, gee, I hope we're going to do this mandate, you can't say, well, Sally, is the only problem. She's not.
Right. Go
it's
shun
hard.
her.
It's hard. I just think that what we've seen is individuals and clients, employers have had a lot more success with the voluntary. There was a slide back there, and by the way, I told Johanna at some point during this that we'll make the slides available, but the slide that talked about incentives, we talked a little bit about paid time, but education, giving them the opportunity to sort of educate themselves, what your personal beliefs are on vaccinations notwithstanding, it is, there's the opportunity to educate them about, the collective, wisdom of a vaccine, right? Because we want to keep each other safe. Ultimately, there's only so much you can do. But I think the answer to that question is, if you wanted to take a hard line on your co-op members being vaccinated, you could do that, but you'll probably lose some co-op members.
Yeah, and I do think that keeping it voluntary is a better go, because that idea of, you can't tell me what to do, like it's my body. And we do have some folks that, have some health issues that might, that they're not as active, they're not coming in as much, but, it's something you're introducing to your body, so that's kind of tough.
It's not an argument, but it's a discussion that you're not going to win. I mean, the individuals that have made up their mind not to, and some, for a whole host of different reasons, you're not going to change people's mind easily. So I think the thing that you do is you try to get as many vaccinated as possible voluntarily,
right.
And then you work with the others.
And I think most people here, I would say most people are really on board. If they're not on board with vaccination, I haven't heard. I haven't heard any, hesitations yet. Another piece of our organization is we have a gallery shop. So, we have customers coming in. We can't ask. It's like going to the grocery store. You can't ask every single person.
Right.
So I think the few folks that have asked about this mandate, we have so many different kinds of people that come through here that it's really problematic. And I know their head's in the right place. They want to keep everyone safe. they want, and knock on wood, we've done a good job so far, but I just don't know
look at
if
it-
mandate is the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it this way, when I see having, my youngest still in college, and seeing the existence that they've had this year, I can see why colleges are mandating.
Oh, yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, it's a virtual petri dish, but
Right. They're
know,
living there, they're working there, they're, yeah.
they're not social distancing.
right.
So, but I think in the employment context, the by far, like I said at the outset, most employers are still heavily tied to the voluntary, vaccination programs, and just trying to convince, people to look at it from a collective perspective as opposed to,
Okay.
an individual.
All right. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, is there anybody else who has questions? I don't see anything in the chat. If you don't mind raising your hand. Any more questions? You can use the chat or raise your hand. This is the time to ask, guys. All right, I don't see any more questions popping up. And again, I do apologize that I can't get on camera, but we don't have internet. So as we stated earlier, or Chris said before, that we're going to be sending out a copy of the presentation to everybody via email. So watch your email this afternoon. We'll get that out to you. Again, thank you so much for joining us for our Tuesday tips. Check our website out for the next couple of weeks. I think we're not on next week because we have a luncheon event, but every Tuesday after from 12 to 1, we'll be here with a lot of different topics for you. So thank you again for joining. Everyone be safe and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christopher. Thank you, Valerie. We
You got it.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you.